It's my great pleasure to introduce our first speaker, Professor Adrian Moore. Professor Moore is Professor of Philosophy, Fellow and Tutor at St Hugh's College, University of Oxford. His research, publications and also broadcast work span a wide range of fields in philosophy, including ethics, philosophy of religion, philosophy of mathematics, metaphysics and the history of philosophy. I have a very tattered, well-loved copy of his book, The Evolution of Modern Metaphysics, Making Sense of Things, which I highly recommend. It charts centuries of philosophical thinking on the question of metaphysics from Descartes to the present. Particularly valuable is its attempt to cut across the divide between analytic and continental philosophy, which some of you will be familiar with. We have some Kierkegaardian sympathizers in the audience. And he proposed his own thesis in this book on how philosophers make sense of reality. Professor Moore's paper is The New Atheism and Morality. Thank you.
Thanks for the introduction, Luke. George did ask earlier how much I paid Luke to flag the copy of my book, but I assure you, nothing at all. Yeah, thanks. So you've already done a lot of our work for us, actually, setting out a lot of the basic issues that arise. As you all know, the theme of today's program is the relationship between belief in God and morality. And Luke has already really helpfully picked up some of the basic questions that this raises, how far it may or may not be helpful if you're trying to think about morality to have a belief in God as well, whether in fact it might be necessary to believe in God in order to be able to sustain some sort of commitment to morality. What I'm planning to do this morning goes off onto a little bit of a tangent, and I hope in due course we'll be able to see some of the connections between what I'm going to say and the issues that Luke has already raised, which will come back to the fore in the discussion this afternoon. But my own focus is going to be on language, some of the ways in which we talk about God and the ways in which we talk about morality. And in a way, my hope is that this will serve as a kind of useful prelude to some of what's coming up later. And as I say, I hope in due course you'll see the connections. But the title that I've given for this presentation is The New Atheism and Morality. And before we go any further, and this is sheer naked curiosity on my part, but I'm going to ask for a show of hands. How many of you are familiar with the phrase, the new atheism? Is this something that you've come across before? Some, but not everybody. That's interesting. It's a phrase that was very much in vogue in the early part of the 21st century, in the early 2000s. And it's used much less frequently now. And it was interesting for me to see how many of you were familiar with it. And I'm not surprised to discover that quite a lot of you haven't come across the phrase. But as I say, if you go back 20, 25 years, people were talking a lot about the new atheism. And what they had in mind was a kind of atheism that was championed by people like Richard Dawkins, who we're going to be focusing on later, Daniel Dennett, Christopher Hitchens, Anthony Grayling. These are examples of people that were styled new atheists. Although Richard Dawkins, who's probably the most famous of all, was always slightly suspicious of the label, and there are places where he says, I'm never quite sure why we were called the new atheists. We're just atheists. But they were called the new atheists because they were championing a kind of atheism that was a little bit different from much of what had gone on previously. It was a kind of, there was something strident and almost evangelical about it, actually. These were a group of people who were committed to atheism, not just on the grounds that they rejected a belief in God, but on the grounds that they thought that belief in God was positively pernicious. It was a kind of campaign for these people to overturn religion, which they thought had done all sorts of untold damage. And this was far more than just a purely intellectual exercise for these guys. This was something that they approached with almost a kind of political fervor. And Richard Dawkins in particular wrote a number of books, probably the most famous being The God Delusion, where he not only argued in favor of atheism, but also, as I say, emphasized why he thought that belief in God was pernicious and needed to be combated. And it's with the new atheism that I want to begin. And in particular, I'd like you to turn to page 2 of the package, where there are some pertinent quotations. And I hope everybody has sight of this. And I want to begin by focusing in particular on the first 3 quotations, which are all by Richard Dawkins, 2 of them from the book that I've already mentioned, The God Delusion, another from the transcript of a debate which he had with John Habgood, who was a bishop and was defending belief in God. And I won't read them out just yet. I want to say a little bit before we actually turn and look at the quotations themselves. I want to say a little bit about the context. The context is that, among other things, the new atheists were united not only by their abhorrence of religion and belief in God, but also by a very deep respect for science. They all had something like a very reverential attitude towards science, and in particular the natural sciences. Richard Dawkins himself is a very famous and very accomplished scientist. That is his background, in particular a geneticist. And this respect for science was very important as part of their crusade against religion, because basically they took the attitude, Richard Dawkins in particular took the attitude, that we have to think of theism as a kind of scientific hypothesis. The claim that God exists, on their view, was something like the claim that, I don't know, there's a big black hole at the center of our galaxy, something that has to be determined by scientific means. And one of the reasons that they were opposed to theism, and in particular, one of the reasons why Richard Dawkins was so opposed to theism, was that he thought it was something like a scientific hypothesis with insufficient evidence. He said, look, we've got this hypothesis, this speculation that there's this supreme being out there that created the universe and keeps it going. And the fact of the matter is that there just isn't good evidence for this belief. And it has to be rejected in the same way as any other bad scientific hypothesis. That was Richard Dawkins' stance on the kind of claim that you're making when you claim that God exists. So let's turn our attention to these three quotations, which one by one serve to emphasize this point that I've just made, that they were viewing theism as a scientific hypothesis. So first of all, the first quotation in the debate with John Habgood, you can't escape the scientific implications of religion. A universe with a God would look quite different from a universe without one. A physics, a biology where there is a God is bound to look different. So the most basic claims of religion are scientific. Religion is a scientific theory. I mean, that's as stark and as blatant as you could hope to find. That's absolutely explicit. Religion is a scientific theory. That was Richard Dawkins' take on the nature of religious belief. Second quotation, very, very similar. Either God exists or he doesn't. Excuse the sexist language, by the way. I mean, this was back in the day when it was routine for everybody to refer to God using the masculine pronoun, and I'm going to do the same because it comes very naturally. Although a lot of people these days, including a lot of theists, try to avoid it. But this is Richard Dawkins. Either God exists or he doesn't. It's a scientific question. One day we may know the answer, and meanwhile we can say some pretty strong things about the probability. And of course we know what Dawkins himself wants to say about the probability, namely that it's extremely low. He has, on a number of occasions, said quite explicitly that the probability is not zero. He's not one of these people who thinks that we can completely and decisively rule out God's existence. So he doesn't think that the probability of God's existence is zero, but he does think that it's incredibly low. He thinks that the evidence for God is minimal and the evidence against God's existence overwhelming. So that's the second quotation. And then the third quotation, which in many respects is my own favorite, and in many respects is the most striking, as you can see, goes as follows. God's existence or non-existence is a scientific fact about the universe. So that's the recurring theme. This is a scientific hypothesis. Discoverable in principle, if not in practice. If he existed, of course Dawkins thinks that God doesn't, but if he existed and chose to reveal it, God himself could clinch the argument noisily and unequivocally in his favor. If he existed and chose to reveal it, God himself could clinch the argument noisily and unequivocally in his favour. Now, it's that second sentence in that third quotation that I want to focus on, the sentence that I've just read out, because I think there's a really interesting issue that arises here, and it is orthogonal to whether you believe in God or not. I'm sure there are some people in the room that are theists. I'm sure there are some people in the room that are atheists. I'm sure that there are people in the room that are agnostics. I'm sure that we've got a spectrum of beliefs as far as that goes. But I think that whether or not you fall into one of those categories as opposed to the other two, whichever of these is your own stances, you can take a further stance on this question. And I think they completely cut across each other. Whether you agree with Dawkins about this point, that God himself could clinch the argument, I think is completely orthogonal to whether you are yourself a theist or not. Some of you may be atheists like Dawkins, and you may agree with Dawkins about this. Some of you may be theists and agree with Dawkins about this. You may think, yes, I do believe that God exists, and I do believe that if God chose to reveal it, he could settle the matter. But I suspect that there are people in the room, in fact, I know that there are people in the room that would disagree with Dawkins about this. And the reason that I know that there are people in the room that would disagree with Dawkins about this is that I'm one of them. And it strikes me as a very, it's a very striking claim that Dawkins is making there. And I personally think that it should seem much more controversial than it's apt to. It's not at all clear to me what he thinks God could do that would settle the matter unequivocally, never mind noisily. I don't know why it has to be noisy. Let's put the noise to one side. But what decisive evidence could God give us for his existence? And I've given a similar talk recently to people in the same position as you, sixth formers, some of whom have been studying philosophy, some of whom haven't, and put this question to them. And I've discovered, I must admit to my own surprise, that a lot of people have agreed with Dawkins about this and have said, oh yes, we can imagine decisive evidence for God's existence. But when I've pressed them on what it is that they have in mind, I must admit, this is purely autobiographical, but I must admit that nothing that they have said has convinced me. I mean, if we all went out, for example, and suddenly saw a cloud formation in the sky that spelt out in English, God exists, would that convince us? No, surely not. I mean, it would be weird, and you'd be wondering what on earth the explanation is, and I think your first thought would be that this was some man-made contrivance, that somebody had somehow been able to manipulate the cloud formation. But it's not obvious to me, at any rate, that there is anything that God could do to give us decisive proof that he existed, even if there is a God. And as I say, this cuts right across the issue of whether you do believe in God or not. The kind of claim that I'm making now is the kind of claim that I think a theist could make. I don't think you have to be an atheist or a theist or an agnostic to be suspicious about Dawkins' second claim. I've already forgotten which is my glass of water. Is it this way? Thanks. Yeah. So, as I say, there's a point, among many others, I must admit, but there's a point at which I personally would want to take issue with Dawkins. Some of you may agree with Dawkins, some of you may agree with me. There may be opportunities later in the day to talk more about this. And I'll leave a little bit of room at the end of this session for Q&A in which people can come back to me on this. But if I'm right, you might be sitting there thinking, okay, but doesn't this raise a further issue? And in particular, doesn't it raise a potential further problem for the theist, the person that does believe in God? Because suppose that you are a theist, and suppose that you think that there could be no decisive evidence for God's existence, and certainly you're going to say that there can't be decisive evidence against God's existence either, then you might be sitting there thinking, well, hold on a sec. In that case, what do we mean when we say that God exists? And this is the point at which language comes into focus. I said right at the beginning I was going to be talking about linguistic issues. But there is a view, which I'm sure a lot of you are familiar with, associated with a group called the logical positivists, whereby it's going to be a really serious problem if you can't have decisive evidence for or against a claim. Now again, before we go any further, and once again this is just sheer naked curiosity on my part, but again I'm going to ask for a show of hands. How many of you are familiar with the term logical positivism? Quite a lot of you have come across this, but not everybody. So logical positivism was a view that was propounded about a century ago. This goes back to the early part of the 20th century. A group of philosophers known as logical positivists who came along and said, look, whether a statement is meaningful or not, whether a statement can be true or false, depends on whether there can be compelling evidence for it or against it. So they gave various examples of statements which, in their view, were meaningless, that didn't have meaning. So one example would be the following statement. Whenever nobody is looking at a banana, it turns purple. The moment you look at it, it becomes yellow again. But when nobody's looking at it, it's purple. So we're being asked to imagine that bananas are constantly switching from yellow to purple. And they're purple when nobody is looking at them, and they're yellow whenever you are looking at them. And I mean, it's a crazy idea. Nobody would take it seriously. But the logical positivists went further. They said, look, this is not just an idea that we shouldn't be taking seriously. This is an idea that just doesn't make sense. This is literally meaningless. The sheer fact that you couldn't verify this, obviously you can't verify it because all you can do is look at a banana. You might sort of look very quickly, hoping to catch it out, but the hypothesis is taking into account how quickly you're doing it. The sheer fact that you couldn't show that this claim was true or show that it was false for that matter means that it doesn't have any meaning according to the logical positivists. Another example would be the following statement. Every second, everything in the universe doubles in size. So this chair, each second, suddenly gets twice as big. But we don't notice because we all get twice as big as well, and it makes absolutely no difference to us. Now, again, the logical positivists said, this is not just a crazy idea. I mean, it is crazy, and again, nobody would take it seriously. But the logical positivists came along and said, it's worse than that. We shouldn't just dismiss it as crazy. We should admit that it doesn't make sense. The sheer fact that we can't tell the difference means that this is strictly meaningless. And this was, if you like, the hallmark of logical positivism, the idea that a statement could only count as meaningful if there was some way of providing compelling or decisive evidence for it or against it. So one by one, they dismissed various claims, various statements as strictly meaningless. But in particular, they included on their list of things that were meaningless the statement, God exists, and a whole lot of other religious claims as well. But in particular, the claim that is supposed to distinguish between theists and atheists. And they said, this is another example of something that just doesn't make sense. We can't imagine decisive evidence for God's existence. We can't imagine decisive evidence against God's existence. We have to admit that this statement is literally meaningless. And so the logical positivists were often said to be atheists, attacking religious claims just in the same way that Richard Dawkins does. But actually, the positivists themselves always insisted that they were not atheists. They used to say, no, this is not atheism. The atheist is somebody who believes that God does not exist. And they said, we're not in that camp. We're doing something in its own way much more radical. We're claiming that the statement doesn't make sense, the statement that God exists. We're not saying that it's false, which is what the atheist says. We're saying that it's strictly meaningless. And so it is an attack on religion, and in particular it's an attack on theism, but it's not the same as the attack that you find from people like Richard Dawkins. Richard Dawkins is definitely an atheist. The logical positivists were not atheists. And as I've already said, in its own way, the logical positivist assault on theism looks even more radical and perhaps even more damaging. Remember, Richard Dawkins was prepared to say the probability that God exists is tiny, but it's not zero. It is possible that God exists. Richard Dawkins was always prepared to say that. The logical positivists were not prepared to say that. So it looks like a more serious assault, but actually I'm going to suggest that in its own way, it's a much more subtle position than Dawkins, and in its own way perhaps a less serious assault on theism. And as I spell out what I have in mind, at last you'll begin to see the connection with morality. I'm sure a lot of you are sitting there thinking he hasn't talked about morality at all yet, and that's supposed to be the theme of today's workshop. But there is a connection, and I hope to tease out that connection in the time that remains. And to understand the connection, we have to go back to the logical positivists and think about exactly what it was that they were claiming. And one way in which they quite often put it was they quite often said that the statement that God exists lacks literal meaning. They quite often use this phrase literal meaning, or at least A.J. Ayer, one of the most famous of the logical positivists, quite often used the phrase literal meaning. And it's serving almost as a technical term in this context, because the contrast is not with metaphorical meaning. What A.J. Ayer meant when he said that a statement lacked literal meaning was it's not the kind of thing that can be true or false. And that was what they insisted about the statement that God exists. But, and this is the crucial thing, the logical positivists were always prepared to admit that there could be meaning of other kinds, what they would have called non-literal meaning. So the sheer fact that something can't be true or false doesn't mean that it's completely lacking in meaning. There can be meaning of other kinds. So there are all sorts of really, really straightforward examples of this. For example, if I ask a question, if I ask what time is the next train to Birmingham, that's perfectly meaningful. That's a perfectly legitimate English sentence which any English speaker will understand. But it's not true or false. A question isn't either true or false. So there are obvious ways in which something can be meaningful without being true or false. A command would be another example. If I say to somebody, oh, shut the door, again, perfectly meaningful. Anybody that knows English will understand what that means. But it's not true or false. If you tell somebody to shut the door, you're not saying something either true or false, but you are saying something meaningful. And those are very simple examples, but there are much more subtle examples as well. And in particular, the logical positivists used to say something like this about moral claims. So let's go back to an example that Luke mentioned in his introductory comments. Suppose that you want to make some moral claim about climate change. Suppose somebody comes along and says, it's absolutely irresponsible for us to take our short-term interests more seriously than the interests of future generations. It's irresponsible or unforgivable for us to take our own short-term interests more seriously than the interests of future generations. Now that's a straightforward example of a kind of a moral claim that somebody might make. And the logical positivists would have said that is lacking in literal meaning. That is neither true nor false. There's no way that you can verify that or falsify that in the same way that you can verify or falsify a scientific claim. So here's an example of something which is literally meaningless in their technical sense of literally meaningless. But that doesn't mean that it's completely meaningless. Again, it's a perfectly legitimate English sentence which has a perfectly legitimate use. And then they had their own story to tell about what kind of meaning it has. And a kind of caricature view of their story is that if you use a word like good, then that's a little bit like cheering. And if you use a word like bad, then that's a little bit like jeering. So, or booing. So it's very much like, you know, the opposing football fans at a football game where the referee makes some controversial decision, gives a player a red card, and all the fans at one end of the stadium are cheering and all the fans at the other end of the stadium are booing. And the logical positivists said, well, it's a bit like that. And if I make this claim about climate change, if I say it's irresponsible to take our own short-term interests more seriously than the interests of future generations, their view was that's a little bit like boo to taking your own short-term interests more seriously than the interests of long-term generations. You're expressing your disapproval of it. You're giving voice to opposition to that in the same way that the football fans express their disapproval of this red card that has just been given to one of the players. Neither true nor false, but a perfectly legitimate linguistic move with a very significant role to play in our lives. They had lots of other examples of statements that were neither true nor false, but still perfectly meaningful. But I'm focusing on moral statements partly because it was one of the most interesting cases, and partly, finally, at long last, to try and draw together the threads. Because again, the theme of today's workshop is the relationship between religious belief and morality. And the fact that the logical positivists were prepared to take this kind of view about moral discourse leaves open the possibility that they might have been prepared to take the same sort of attitude to religious discourse. So it would have been quite possible for a logical positivist to come along and say exactly what the logical positivists did say, which is that claims about God and about God's existence are literally meaningless, neither true nor false, but nevertheless, they can play a very significant role in our lives. It might be quite meaningful discourse in another sense of meaningful. It might be quite important discourse in another sense of important. And it might be exactly like moral discourse. It may be a way of expressing some deep commitment that you have. So let's turn finally to the fourth quotation on the handout, the quotation from A.J. Ayer, a very famous book that he wrote called Language, Truth and Logic, which was a kind of credo for logical positivism. He was one of the famous logical positivists. And you'll see in this fourth quotation the kind of point that I've just been trying to make. According to the account that we obviously in this context means logical positivists, according to the account that we have given of religious assertions, there's no logical ground for antagonism between religion and natural science. So this is in stark contrast to Richard Dawkins, who obviously thinks that there is antagonism between religion and natural science. No, says A.J. Ayer, as far as the question of truth or falsehood is concerned, there's no opposition between the natural scientist and the theist who believes in a transcendent God. For since the religious utterances of the theist are not genuine propositions at all, which is his way of saying that they lack literal meaning, they cannot stand in any logical relation to the propositions of science. The propositions of science are all either true or false. Religious propositions, religious statements, are of a completely different kind. They're like questions or commands. They're neither true nor false. So there's a kind of mismatch here. We shouldn't be comparing them. It's a little bit like that thing that people often say, which is religion and science are trying to do completely different things. Science is concerned with the question how. Religion is concerned with the question why. You'll often hear people making that kind of claim, and the logical positivists were sensitive to that kind of claim. And then finally, on the handout, perhaps the most striking thing of all, A.J. Ayer goes on to say, an interesting feature of this conclusion is that it accords with what many theists are accustomed to say themselves. So this is A.J. Ayer's way of saying, look, the fact of the matter is that this is the kind of view that theists themselves could take seriously. I mean, he was not himself any kind of theist. He was almost as vehemently opposed to theism as Richard Dawkins is. But nevertheless, he was keen to make the point that you could be a theist and buy into a lot of logical positivism. There will be some theists that will certainly want to resist this, because there will be some theists who will want to say, no, I want to insist that it's true that God exists. So the kind of theist that he has in mind here is the kind of theist who's prepared to say that it's not true that God exists. And you might think, well, that's a funny kind of theist. But you've got to remember that they're saying not true as opposed to true, not true in the sense of false. So in other words, this is the kind of theist who thinks that we're dealing with two quite different language games, if you're familiar with the terminology of language games. And it's a striking view in its own right, but it's also especially striking in the context of today's session, because it signals a connection between religion and morality, or between the language of religion and the language of morality, because that's just the same kind of thing that you might want to say about moral discourse. It's not compulsory by any means, and I think George will be coming up later and giving us a good account of how somebody might want to resist this view of moral discourse. But nevertheless, it's a respectable view, and it's a view that should be on the table. Now, I'm conscious of the time, and we did want to make sure that we left room at the end for Q&A. So I think I'll stop at that point and see if there are questions that people have.